I have met several very different people, academics who are different in character, in temperament, in location, but told me the same thing. Before we sit down to write, we read a little bit of George Orwell's writing. This gets us into the right mood. We try to emulate his style. Today, we're going to ask why. What is so special about this author, about George Orwell, that so many people view him as an ideal, as a perfect writer, as a guide to writing well? My name is Shai Lutan. I am Associate Professor of International and Public Law at the University of Copenhagen Faculty of Law, and the purpose of this series of lectures is to help you improve your research skills and your English. The first thing that comes to the mind of most people when they hear about George Orwell are two novels, Animal Farm and 1984. These are novels that were adapted to numerous movies. They had enormous impact on our culture. They're translated to every language, and all over the world they are famous and have a great contribution to world literature. I want to say a little bit about Animal Farm. I read this novel when I was very young, and I read it in Hebrew, and I cannot say much about the way that it contributes to English and to English writing. The story is known to most. There is a revolution in a farm where animals are being misused. The animals take control of the farm, drive away the farmers, drive away their attempts to regain the farm. Inside the farm, there are different types of animals. There are the pigs that are very smart. There are animals like the horse that is very strong. And the pigs basically manipulate everybody and become some kind of a ruling oligarchy that is using more and more the resources of the farm just to themselves. All the great ideas that they had when the farm was taken from a farmer for equality, compared to a democracy, are being destroyed. The pigs come at night, they change the constitution that is written on the barn door, and instead of writing, for example, all animals are equal, they write all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Brilliant phrase, trying to show how societies deteriorate into totalitarianism, into a system that is harmful for their own citizens. And that's a great allegory that is completely obvious. The closest criticism that we see there is, of course, to the Soviet Union, starting out from the most incredible ideas and ending up in a vicious, murderous regime against its own citizens. And you can also use it to some extent against a lot of other regimes. Even if they're still democracies, we have this metaphor that is very useful. So that's what I have to say about Animal Farm. That's not a lot. But 1984 is something bigger than that. Now, the story of 1984 is kind of a fictional story of a society that is in the nearby future. So imagine that he was writing that, for example, in around the 40s. So he's speaking about 40 years forward. And in this society, we have totalitarian countries, particularly one country that the protagonist is in. And the protagonist is trying to hide his personal thoughts, eventually his love affair that is forbidden, from this completely mind-controlling and interventionist society where nobody has any privacy, when the government controls everything. It's completely a dystopian totalitarian regime where nobody has even a moment of freedom. Imagine that he was writing that when the technology was much less advanced than today. So a lot of things that today would be very easily done, for example, completely revising the history every single day, was very difficult to do. He had to invent a situation where people would actually bring all the written materials, the books and newspapers would be burnt, and new versions would come every day. Today we have the internet, we don't have to use paper anymore. That's very easily done. Cameras, you could imagine a situation where it would be a camera that would view you in the morning while you are stretching and making exactly the military style exercise that you have to do in your own apartment. Today we have cameras everywhere. It's very, very easy to do. So the message against totalitarian regimes is a very strong one and is clearly relevant today, much more than when it was written, because technologically our ability to dictate very, very specific moves and invade people's privacy is much greater. So that's obvious and a clear criticism against totalitarian regimes that is relevant for today. But there is another part of a plot of a book that is absolutely essential and has to do with language, and that's the only reason why I'm presenting this today, because I don't view myself as an expert on George Orwell. I read just a little of him, his great non-fiction documentary books I haven't read. I have read a few of his essays, but I read the essays that he wrote, at least some of them, about writing. And that's the angle that I'm interested in today, because the entire purpose of this series of lectures is to improve your writing in English. So if you go back to this part of the book, we see the following story. The story is that in this fictional totalitarian society, there is a dictionary that gets revised every year. But instead of our dictionary that gets revised to include new words that are relevant, this dictionary is getting revised to erase words. Every word that is not essential but has a potential synonym or a word that is like it gets erased. So we would still have words like good and bad, but we will not have words like terrific or magnificent or wonderful or great or excellent, because all these words are basically similar to good. So you could say something like double good to indicate that this is very good. And you erase these words. And the argument, the reason why the totalitarian regime is investing so many resources in narrowing down the language is the claim that you cannot really think about the thoughts that make you a free man or woman without certain words. So if you only have very, very limited vocabulary, your ability to think about lofty ideals, about great values, is just hindered in a way that is completely irreparable. That's exactly the point that the book makes. That even though the words that remain in the dictionary are enough to make you survive, you can order the food that you want, you can do the work that you want. By the way, there's a whole section of the dictionary that is technical words. That's actually getting extended, because you want to have functioning tanks and missiles and so on. But you will never be able to express true love, whether it's the love of a man to a woman, or a mother to a child, or even a man to his country, that will make him rise one day and say, we revolt because we care about the freedom of our country or the future of our country. So all these words are erased. Now that's a very interesting intellectual exercise when you come to think about it. And it leads you to thinking, what is the great value of learning English or any other language and building a strong vocabulary? It's not just to impress other people. It's a tool that allows you to think thoughts that would otherwise be unthinkable. And this goes back to a mantra that I repeat. If you listen to my videos, you know that I say it almost every time. Writing is thinking. If you're not able to write through a topic, and this includes having the proper vocabulary, this also includes the other techniques that we study, including building a proper sentence, organizing your thoughts properly, you will just not be able to think these thoughts. They will disappear from your psyche completely. You will not be able to conceive them within you. And that's, I think, is a very important message. When you try to think about a language, a very large and diverse vocabulary with a lot of words that seem redundant is somehow necessary in order to think the most important thoughts there are, the thoughts that make us able to live a fruitful and a life that is worth living, the thoughts that make it possible for us to organize in communities that are based on values that we hold dear. And that's exactly the point that is made in 1984 by George Orwell. Now, I have to say that when I read this book, also I wasn't a child, but it was many, many years ago, and I think that my English was not good enough to be a judge of the quality of English of George Orwell. But I have heard, so I said, from many, that this is something that he was not just preaching in his writing, but he was very, very much exercising it in his own prose, that is very, very beautiful. Going from the novels that made George Orwell famous all over the world to writings that are known by just a few, usually it's writing nerds, but these are the most important ones for our purposes. And these are his essays about writing. In his essays, he offers very, very shrewd and useful advice that aims towards something, I think, very particular. To my class, I always tell the first thing that you need to think about when you think about George Orwell and his writing techniques is saying that good writing is like a window pane. A window pane, you go and you see through the window what is going on outside, and the thing that the writing provides is just the boundaries through which you can see for yourself. You can see the truth for yourself. And that, I think, is a beautiful metaphor, because it means that the writer is not trying to dress up reality in a certain way. He's not trying to offer you the own version of reality. He's trying to make it possible for you to see reality. Try to think about it, reflect about it for a while. It's not that easy to be a window pane. It's very, very difficult. Even if you're using photographs, it's always possible to photograph one part, not the other. You're describing something significant, like, I don't know, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and you're writing a 2,000 word essay about it. In order to reflect reality as it is, you need to know a lot. You need to do your research. But mostly, you need to be a very, very good writer that allows the reader to see the different aspects of the issue: historical, political, diplomatical, humanistic. All these things have to come out in your own writing. Now, how to do that is something that George Orwell explains in several articles or essays. And some of them are so good that they even publish as books in their own right. They're very short books. The most famous one probably is called Politics and the English Language. And that's the main one that I want to focus on today. In this essay, George Orwell develops one particular thesis, which I think is quite difficult to maintain. And this thesis is that in writing, in good writing, you need to avoid what he calls dying metaphors. What is a dying metaphor? Let's start with what is easy. What is a dead metaphor? If I would say something like, in light of all the above, George Orwell is a great writer, I'm not referring to anything that involves a physical light. Okay? It's possible that if you hear that, you would have a mental picture of a physical light when you hear me. And in fact, there is research that shows that to some extent, there is such a mental picture that comes to mind when you say something like in light of. But if you use the language in a way that most people understand it, you will realize that it is not something that involves a clear metaphor. You don't necessarily have to think about light. In light of is just like a single word in the English language that means accordingly or according to the above. So you don't necessarily have to think about the metaphor. That's a dead metaphor. Now, if you try to think about what is a living metaphor, this is a metaphor that you just made up, that is trying to explain exactly a particular situation. Okay, so if you say that George Orwell is, I'm trying to think, as clear in his writing as watching through an iceberg, because you cannot see exactly through it, but you see some lucid things. I don't know. I don't have. It's very, very difficult to come up with a good metaphor on the spot, but it's something that nobody described before, but I don't remember anybody saying looking for a piece of ice. Okay, that's a very, very, very bad living metaphor. The problem is, according to George Orwell, when we start to speak about things that he calls dying metaphors. So dying metaphors would be something like, I'm standing shoulder to shoulder with my friends. It's not part of a language, as in a night off, but at the same time, it's not something that I invented right now to address a particular issue. I'm regurgitating something that already exists in the language, something that a lot of people use. Standing shoulder to shoulder means we try to work together. The problem is that now I've created a mental picture in the mind of my listeners without actually committing to it. So I'm really not encouraging them to thinking about shoulder to shoulders, but at the same time, the mental picture is up somehow there. And then, of course, you could have the dangerous situations of mixed metaphors. The famous example is, I think it was Nikita Khrushchev who said something like, um, once we were standing at the edge of a cliff, but now we have taken one great leap forward. So if you take these two metaphors, the cliff one and the leap forward one, you would actually be falling into a death from the cliff. And that's an example of a mixed metaphor. But even if you don't mix the metaphor, the problem is that you're throwing your readers aside to metaphors that you're not actually committed to because you didn't come up with them yourself for a particular situation. Now, why am I saying that that's not a very, very tenable thesis? Because George Orwell himself made quite a lot of dying metaphors in his essay, and many people commented on that. And it's difficult to make very original metaphors. A lot of metaphors were done before, and metaphors are important in our writing and our speaking, and therefore it's not a very strong thesis. At the same time, as almost a side note, this is a brilliant essay that in a couple of pages says all the main comments that appear in most of the style books until today. So write succinctly, don't use words that are not necessary, don't use foreign words unless it's absolutely impossible to do otherwise. Try to use the active voice whenever you can. All these things are written and they're weaved into the writing in a very nice way. So that's why if you want to read an essay about writing and you're short in time, you don't even have time to read Strunk and White, the classical book on a topic, read George Orwell, Politics in the English Language, and in a few pages you get most of what you need to get. In addition to that, the book combines it with the other great passion of George Orwell, so writing and the connection to politics. And what he explains is basically that the way in which we allow horrible crimes to persist is from using very obscure language. Because if everybody wrote language as a window pane and it would show the pain and suffering and horrors of war and horrors of dictatorial regimes, they will not survive it because people will not allow it. But if you allow the language to continue through circles of prose that doesn't involve emotion, that weakens our understanding instead of improving it, then crimes can occur. And that's exactly where the politics come into play. Right? That's why it's politics in the English language. So the combination, I think, is important. You see it in 1984. Again, you have the dictionary that goes smaller, and you have the story about this dystopian society that is very similar to the way totalitarian societies can behave. So that's exactly the argument that we see in George Orwell. Now, George Orwell had other essays about writing. Some were very short, just things that he published in newspapers and magazines. He had other essays that are beautifully written and also make a political point. The most famous one by far is Shooting an Elephant, that describes a situation of a British colony where people are saying that an elephant has gone mad and they call to the colonialists to shoot it. The colonist is coming and now he's carrying the authority of the law and he sees that the elephant is actually fine. He's not mad at all, but he has to shoot it in a way because otherwise the locals would start to doubt his power and his authority. So what he shows is basically that when colonizers occupying a country, they become themselves the slaves because now they have to do irrational things to satisfy the locals because otherwise they lose their authority. So very vivid essay that in a few words shows exactly both the political side that yearns for freedom and equality and justice, and the language side that through very, very vivid pictures is able to communicate this across decades. Even until today, we can read this essay and feel it very, very well because George Orwell was really practicing that, thinking as writing, writing as a window pane that gives transparency, that gives us access to deeper truths. And that's exactly what makes him such a great writer. So anything written by George Orwell is recommended to read. And if you are trying to improve your English, read his essays about English. This will be a great help to your improvement.